Hi, my name is Sonja Aits. I'm from Lund University, and I'm going to talk about biomedical natural language processing and how it can be used in drug development. So, one of the main applications of natural language processing that everyone is familiar with is these web searches and the autocomplete that you see in them. But there's many other types of NLP that you will encounter in your daily life, whether it's using automated translations or you have maybe an automated speaker, personal assistant, or you just have a junk mail filter on your email. And also, of course, like stuff like error detection on Word and other text programs. So there's many different applications of NLP which we encounter daily and maybe don't even think about so much. And in general, you could summarize that NLP is computational analysis and generation of natural language, and this could be either text or speech. And this is opposed to artificial language, which is computational language. So BioNLP then is NLP related to medicine and life science. So anything from clinical language to research type language. And it could be in any language, but the predominant one is, of course, in English nowadays. So there's many different types of biomedical language data, which we as scientists encounter. And the main one is maybe scientific literature if you're in drug development. But there's also stuff like reports, and this could be reports from authorities or in-house reports, could be just lab reports, such as research notes. Could be database content, so short descriptive text that you're reading in databases. It could be the text that you encounter in electronic health records, so something that doctors have written about the patients. There's patents, of course, also in the biomedical domain. There's doctor-patient conversations. So this would be our audio data instead of written data. There's social media, which is both images and video, and sometimes the images have text on them and the videos have captions. And there's, of course, also the text that's written on social media and also other type of online content, whether it's news articles and so on. So all this type of data is something that could be processed with different forms of natural language processing. And it's really essential in drug development that the researchers involved in this process and also the other people that are supporting it have access to up-to-date scientific knowledge. And this sounds trivial, but it's actually a huge challenge because the up-to-date knowledge is growing steadily. And currently, the main medical research database, which lists scientific literature, has over 34 million articles. And humans can no longer process the accumulated medical knowledge. And that is a problem because even with groups of reviewers, it's very hard to stay on top of this because even in a specific field, for example, in cell death, there's more than 50,000 publications a year. And that is something that we cannot handle anymore, which means that the knowledge is there, but it's not used in an optimal way if we don't extract the information in any automated form. And the problem is not just that there's one article which may have the information that you seek for, but rather that the information is scattered across a whole range of articles. So for example, you could have the situation that at some point in the 90s, someone discovered that a drug A has a relationship with the gene B. And maybe this article came from endocrinology. And then maybe 10 years later, someone found that the gene B has a close relation with gene C. But maybe this article came from cancer research. And then maybe last year, someone found that gene C was very important for coronavirus replication, for example, which tells you as a researcher that maybe drug A is something you should be looking at in your lab experiment to see whether it can help you treat COVID-19. The problem is, though, that it's very unlikely that the virologist who came across Article 3 also came across Article 1 and 2 from two different fields and two different decades. And that's a problem because humans, we have to limit our search. We use specific keywords, but we also limit sometimes with the time and with the field of research, and that's a problem. So what we're looking for often is not for information which is like a needle in a haystack, but rather a series of needles scattered across a series of haystacks, and that makes it even more challenging. NLP can then be used to find and combine these knowledge fragments. So basically, the computer can read through thousands or even millions of articles and then connect these fragments of information into a chain that tells you clearly that drug A could potentially have something to do with the coronavirus. So how does this type of information extraction work? So I will go through an example workflow. Here we typically start with a text, and in many cases, this is scientific literature, which we collect in PubMed. Then the next step is named entity recognition, and I will go into the details of this in a minute. And then we have named entity linking and relationship extraction. So what is named entity recognition? It is basically that the computer goes through a text and labels different types of entities, different types of keywords. It could be proteins, it could be genes, could be processes, could be relations. Keywords could be drugs, could be diseases, could be mutations, could be cell lines, could be anything basically the researcher is interested in. And you have different types of classes that the computer can identify. And then you need to link this type of keywords that you found to a specific entity. And the reason we need that is because researchers use a lot of different synonyms for the same thing. So often, for example, there are 10 or more different names in use for the same protein. And this means that we need to link to a unique identifier. Often we use those that are present in the large bioinformatics databases, such as UniProt or the NCBI gene database. And once you have found your unique entity, and then you can also look at relations between them. So here we have, for example, a sentence which describes a relation between SARS-CoV-2 and ACE2. And this relation is of the type binding. But it could also be other types of things such as cleavage or inhibition or phosphorylation. It very much depends on what you're looking for. Once you have these bits of information, basically entity one, a type of linkage, and then entity two, you can connect these puzzle pieces into larger networks, which we call knowledge graphs. And one example that does this is a string database, which is a protein-protein interaction database that has one of the information channels from natural language processing. And it basically goes through text and finds text pieces that describe a relation between two proteins, and then uses it to piece together these networks and combine it with experimental data and other types of information. You can, of course, also add additional types of information. So, for example, you can, once you have the unique identifiers, link out to different databases using these identifiers. This could be drug databases, it could be genetic databases, and so on. NLP can, of course, also be used for other types of text. So it doesn't have to be scientific literature. This could either be in-house reports that you have, but it could also be something like electronic health records. So in the same way as we can go through scientific text, we can also go through the patient records and the free text that is written by doctors in them. And there we can find information, for example, about the drugs a patient is taking, about the symptoms the patient had or didn't have, and a time point of these symptoms. And from this, we can then put together kind of a patient profile, which we can use for epidemiology and clinical research, or in the future, even for personalized treatment decisions. And in this type of data, we typically need to have it in the country of origin language. So this means that we would, in Sweden, have to have systems that understand this in Swedish, whereas the scientific literature around the world is typically published in English. NLP also enables us to use other types of information that were not traditionally used so much, but are being picked up more and more. So, for example, people can mine information in social media or online forums, such as typical symptoms or side effects that people describe in patient forums and so on. In addition to building these knowledge graphs, you can also use this type of information extraction to power a question answering system. So there you have a user question, which is then analyzed by an NLP system to extract the typical entities that you're looking for. And then you link this up with the document sources that match this type of question. You can retrieve suitable passages, you can rank them by importance, and then you can even summarize the text and display it back to the user. So the user could, in this case, be a researcher, for example, who is interested in information such as potential adverse effects or other information about a drug they are working on. So NLP has many, many different applications. It's not just information extraction and answering systems. You can also use semantic search. This means not simple search by keywords, but rather something more like resembling a topic. You can do topic modeling. So in order to cluster text of interest and find texts that are relevant to you, you can use dialogue systems such as chatbots, for example, to inform patients. You can use speech recognition, both to transcribe doctor-patient conversations, but also maybe to transcribe lab notes that are spoken into a dictaphone. You can use it for translation. For example, when you're handling regulatory affairs, you can use it for text classification or sentiment analysis, and you can use it for text summarization and also for image video captioning. So basically all types of tasks that involve the analysis or generation of text or speech. This means that NLP can support many, many steps of drug development. I'm listing a few ones here. So for example, if you're in the early drug discovery phase, you could use NLP to help you with gene disease mapping by going through literature. In the same way, you can try to help yourself with biomarker discovery. You can look for drugs that could be repurposed. You can identify potential drug targets. You can rank your leads that you got from a screen, for example. And you could also predict adverse events based on other drugs having described similar adverse events or linking together pathways. Once you are in the stage where you have clinical trials, NLP can help identify suitable patients. This is especially important if it's more rare diseases where it's hard to find patients. You can then also use it to monitor the patients by extracting information from the patient journals that have been taken down by the doctors. You can use it for pharmacogenomic studies, where you often, in the end, need to find out more about a certain mutation or a certain gene, and you want to search the literature for information. You want to maybe help yourself with regulatory document preparation. This could be simple translation or summarization or text classification or prioritization for you should be looking through, and even text generation. Pharmacovigilance is another important step where NLP can be of help. So, for example, adverse event detection in reports that come in could be done by NLP. You can also find more information from electronic health records, for example, about drug-drug interactions. And you can also use it to anonymize patient data. This could be also important for the clinical trials in between, when you basically want to share data with a collaborator, but you do not wish to disclose the information of the patients. So what is NLP really under the hood? There's two different approaches or main approaches to NLP. There's a more traditional one, and that relies on dictionaries and rules. So dictionaries are a very, very long list of synonyms or keywords that are being matched. And this can sometimes also be matched with fuzzy matching, which means that you have a couple of typos that could be allowed or so on. Then you have things like rules, and this builds often on the knowledge of the researchers. So for example, you could have a rule that detects all the words ending with "silin" as an antibiotic, because you know that this is a typical ending used in the antibiotics drug class. But you can also use the grammatical structure of the sentence for relation extraction, for example, and then build on linguistic rules. And this still has use today in many contexts, but it's not the only approach that is used today. Instead, we also use deep neural networks, and here we have networks that have been pre-trained with a very large corpus. So corpus is a selection of text data. So these models have, for example, been trained on the entire Wikipedia or the entire PubMed, stuff like that. And then you get a trained language model, which has an intrinsic understanding. And I don't mean that in a real understanding, but it has kind of a statistical representation of the language that is occurring in the text that you're analyzing. And these language models, they are freely available. So, for example, BioBERT or SciBERT are important bio-NLP models that are made freely available. Then you use these big pre-trained models and you fine-tune them on a target task and corpus. And this is where, for example, the target task could be detecting protein names, or it could be finding the relations between drugs and proteins. So then you also have to have an annotated corpus, and this requires a lot of annotated data, and this is often the most time-consuming part of such a project, because you need to have high quality annotations, which means that ideally more than one researcher will go through a lot of text and hand label them with the entities that you are interested in finding, if not such a text has already been made available. You can also incorporate existing knowledge into NLP systems. So often, for example, you have an NLP system with several models that will give you predictions, but then it's hard to rank between two models, for example, if they detect a conflict. So one model can maybe tell you that this is a disease, or another model can tell you this is a gene. And then you can use your existing knowledge that, for example, disease names often contain a gene to rank the entities that you have detected and thereby get the true ones in the end. So this is where the researcher knowledge is really important. Nevertheless, NLP is by no means an area that is completely solved with AI today, because it is an extremely difficult task. So language is extremely ambiguous. If you consider the sentence, the inspectors sent restaurant employees home because they suspected a disease outbreak. From the grammatical structure of the sentence, it is not clear who they is. It is only from our real world knowledge that we know that it's the inspectors that likely do the suspecting and they send home the employees because but this is only because we know this makes sense in the context of the COVID pandemic, for example. But it could also be that the inspectors sent the restaurant employees home because they wanted to hush up an outbreak, for example. And so we as humans judge language a lot with our existing background knowledge, but a computer system cannot do this. So this makes it sometimes very tricky for a computer to handle these ambiguous sentences. There's also the situations where we, for example, have, if you would run simple keyword matching, we have protein names that resemble verbs. So for example, the verb ran, like ran a Western blot, is the same as the protein name ran. And this is also something that if you just do keyword matching, it will trip you up. There's also something what we call co-reference. So people, in order to make the text more interesting for human readers, don't like to be repetitive, which means that they use words like this disease or it or this horrible pandemic and so on. That makes it very hard to link back to a computer system which maybe only analyzes one sentence at a time. We also have, as I mentioned before, a lot of synonyms. So especially, for example, in the area of COVID-19, before we had official names, people made up all kinds of names for the virus and the disease. And these could be very creative, let's call it like that, like Wuhan seafood market virus. And it's very hard to find all of these and put them into a pre-existing keyword search. And that's why the deep learning models can be superior in this context, because they can build on the context and make predictions based on that. We also have a way of writing sentences in different ways, but they all mean the same thing. So for example, this cause cell death means the same as this killed the cells. But if you try any type of keyword matching, you will completely fail. We also have a lot of abbreviations, many of them custom made. So that means that each author makes up their own abbreviations. Hopefully they list them in an abbreviation list, which should accompany most articles, but often people forget one or two. And then it's troublesome to try and find the correct ones. There's also negations. So a relation could be negated, for example, or it could be described with uncertainty. And that is, of course, not the same thing as saying A binds to B, saying this could potentially mean that A binds to B. And if you do knowledge extraction, you need to be careful with this. Another aspect is that using AI in the medical domain in general, we do always have to consider the ethical side of this. So if we have biased training data in any formal way, and especially if we, for example, do this with patient records, this is very problematic, because if we have biased data and the predictions that could be made or the knowledge that could be extracted could be unsafe or inaccurate, or it could discriminate against certain groups of patients which are not very frequently found in the training data. So the golden rule of data science, as always, is garbage in, garbage out. So it is extremely important that when training and evaluating NLP systems for medical use, that we really do our due diligence and carefully check the training and evaluation data for potential biases. The other aspect is that thanks to the power of NLP, anonymous data may sometimes not be as anonymous as we would like it to be, because simply removing the names of a patient or the date of birth doesn't mean that we cannot still find information in the text amount that we have about this patient that could allow us to link it back, especially when combined with other data sets. And there's almost a scary thought that there's no such thing as anonymous data. I'm not sure if this is completely true, but it tells you that even if we really try to make things anonymous, and even if we really try not to have data breaches, in some cases we simply cannot foresee it and we cannot prevent it. And if we collect data, there is a risk that it can be breached. Another aspect is that AI models are energy hungry. That means that training the models, but also running the models, causes a lot of energy consumption. If I, as a researcher, connect to my laptop, I fire it up and then I connect to a supercomputer to run my NLP research. Then this supercomputer was assembled from parts that have been transported all around the world. They have been produced in countries which sometimes do not have the same environmental and labor standards that we have, or actually typically don't have. And also we have sourced raw materials, which in themselves can be environmentally problematic. And across all this production line, we produce waste and pollution, and we also consume a lot of energy. And this is something that we should consider, and this is why I think, and many other people think, that it's very important that we share these large models with each other, so that at least once they are trained, they can be reused by others, so that they don't have to repeat the whole process. So if you find this topic interesting, I can recommend our collection of training and information that we have collected on GitHub. This is publicly available to anyone. So this is a bunch of different resources on NLP and other AI in medicine and life science, and AI in general topics and programming. So if you want to learn more, this is where you could try to find out. We also have sometimes events on this topic in the AI Lund network. All of these are publicly available for free. And you can also contact me. You can find me on the web, and I'd be happy to answer questions at any point. And we're, of course, also happy to take on students or collaborate with other groups. We're very pro open science. Thank you.